Okay, it looks like we've got some more information on the Harrenhal stage play that's been in the works for the past couple of years. So here we've got an article from Deadline. Game of Thrones heads to the Royal Shakespeare Company stage this summer for new adventures from Westeros. The Royal Shakespeare Company, I'm actually quite impressed. So let's have a look at the article. If we see here, we've got George R.R. Martin at Stratford-upon-Avon, not working on The Winds of Winter still, I see. And let's get into the article. I'll just zoom this in a little bit. Here we go. George R.R. Martin is bringing the world of Westeros to the stage with the world premiere of Game of Thrones, The Mad King, which begins performances at the Royal Shakespeare Company's flagship Royal Shakespeare Theatre at Stratford-upon-Avon this summer. Okay, so it's going to be called The Mad King. So the Mad King obviously is Aerys II. So Jaime Lannister is called the Kingslayer, and this is the king that he slayed. Aerys II is the father of Daenerys Targaryen. He's also the grandson of Egg from Knight of the Seven Kingdoms as well. We know who the Mad King is. Director Dominic Cook, who has worked on the project for several years with award-winning playwright Duncan Macmillan, tells us there will be some really thrilling big moments in the play. And yeah, we know a bit about Harrenhal. We know quite a lot, actually, in terms of the general direction of what happens. I don't think it's a secret that there's a lot of fighting going on, but we're sort of trying to find a theatrical way of doing things, Cook says. Yeah, that could be a bit tricky. Harrenhal, they're having a tournament at Harrenhal, like there's a tournament in Knight of the Seven Kingdoms Season 1. I guess you can do that on film, on TV, but how would you do that on stage? That's quite interesting to see, I think. How would you do that? The production will have a star-crossed lovers vibe set against the backdrop of a jousting tournament on Harrenhal, set over a decade and a half before the events in the HBO Game of Thrones dramas. Yeah, so I think it's like 17, 18 years before, and it involves this guy's mum and dad quite a bit. Okay, let's carry on. The people who attended the tourney was a young Ned Stark, his sister Lyanna, and Jaime Lannister. So those ones, and then Robert Baratheon, they're the sort of main characters, and they're the characters that people really know, but much younger, Cook explains. Right, so Ned Stark, Lyanna, Jaime Lannister, Robert Baratheon. So Robert Baratheon, he wins the melee. He wins the fighting bit of the tourney at Harrenhal, and I think at this point he's already engaged to be married to Lyanna. So yeah, Lyanna is there as well. Ned Stark is also there, and also I think that Ned Stark's two brothers are there. So Benjen is at the tourney at Harrenhal, and Brandon is there as well. To be honest, I don't think Ned is really a main character. On it, in the main series, obviously he's a main character, but at this point, he's just a second son. So Brandon is the main guy. Jaime Lannister joins the Kingsguard at Harrenhal, I believe, and then gets sent away relatively early. I wonder if they'll be changing that. So there's a whole sort of King Aerys and Tywin Lannister thing going on there. So Tywin Lannister is the hand of the king, but about now, I think, is when Tywin resigns as hand of the king. And as a kind of twisted revenge, King Aerys recruits Jaime into the King's Guard. So that is an important point in the war, in the rebellion that's going to come afterwards, but are they going to keep him around longer? I mean, it's a different version. it doesn't have to be completely faithful to the books. So if they want to keep Jaime around longer, but as far as I know, he leaves the tourney relatively early because he's under orders to leave the tourney, and he goes back to King's Landing. But Lyanna, yes, Lyanna is definitely a main character here because this is where she meets Rhaegar. Okay. Varys will also make an appearance. Yeah, so Varys at this point is an advisor to King Aerys, and one piece of advice here is that he tells King Aerys he should attend the tournament. So presumably Aerys is going to be a character as well, because the tournament is technically for Lord Went and for Lord Went's daughter. But one theory that goes round is that Rhaegar, the king's son, was using the tourney at Harrenhal as an informal great council to talk about how to get his dad out of the kingship and how to replace him. And Varys finds out and feeds into Aerys' paranoia. So I'm interested to see Varys, but I think, yeah, he should be a minor player in this particular story. There are other characters in the play that end up playing larger parts in the series, but are playing quite small parts here. Yeah, so we've got quite a long list of people that we know attend the tourney at Harrenhal. I guess a comparable event would be the War of the Nine Penny Kings, which I think is maybe 10 or 20 years before the tourney at Harrenhal. So in the War of the Nine Penny Kings, it was kind of a networking opportunity, I guess you could say. And Harrenhal is kind of the networking opportunity for the new generation here. So we've got people like John Connington, Mace Tyrell, Oberyn Martell, there's Manderlys there, there's even sort of houses, relatively minor houses, such as the Mormonts as well. So it's kind of the tourney at Harrenhal is kind of a who's who in Westeros, really, I think. Helpfully, Cook says that one of our ambitions is to make a show that really works for people who don't know the material as people who do, and every sort of shade in between. Because obviously there will be people who come who don't know it, and we want to give them a satisfying evening as well. So we've sort of tried to make a contained thing as well as something that gives the fans all the extra bits of story they don't know. I kind of like this attitude, saying, you know, we want to give the fans something, but we also want the general audience to be involved as well. That sounds kind of similar, a similar tone to what Ira Parker has been saying about Night of the Seven Kingdoms. So that's quite hopeful that he recognises that there are different kinds of audience for this. Let's scroll down a bit. Lyanna Stark, when we see her in The Mad King, is in her teens, about 16. She's one character that people don't know very well and is sort of a central character, Cook explains. She's a really good swords person. A swords person. Is that like the gender neutral swordsman? Swordswoman? Swordsman? Swordsperson? Okay. She's a really good swords person, so she doesn't really fit the mould of how the women at the time were supposed to behave. But she's also very intuitive and very smart, and she's a live wire, he says. She's got a rebellious streak to her, and also, like everyone in that world, if you're in these high families, you have to conform. And this is where it's rather like Shakespeare. Yeah, that seems like someone who understands who Lyanna Stark is. So I guess in the books and in Game of Thrones, the Lyanna Stark substitute is Arya Stark. So physically she is described in a similar way to Arya, and Lyanna are described in similar ways in terms of behaviour as well. So that's hopeful. That's someone who's taken some time to understand who the character is. If you're in these high families, you have to conform. I guess this means she doesn't like her betrothal to Robert. Yeah, so in that case, she is a bit trapped by her position. So Arya is a bit younger and is kind of doing her own thing already in a Game of Thrones. But Lyanna is a bit older. She's coming towards the adult responsibilities, and yeah, she's struggling, I think, at the time of the tourney of Harrenhal, with the fact that she's betrothed to Robert, who she doesn't want to marry because Ned's told her what Robert is like. George R.R. Martin, still not writing The Winds of Winter. I asked Cook which character from Shakespeare she might identify most closely with, like a character out of Joan of Arc in Henry VI, or even Rosalind in As You Like It, he suggests. I don't know about Joan of Arc, but yeah, I like the Rosalind comparison. And I like the comparison to Shakespeare generally. I think George R.R. Martin is definitely tapping into those kind of archetypes, those kind of characters and stories that we want to tell over and over again. Although already promised to Robert Baratheon, Lyanna instead gets together, as Cook puts it, with Rhaegar Targaryen, the son of Aerys, the Mad King of the title. She's Ned Stark's beloved sister and has a lot in common with her niece, Arya Stark. There's a bit of a Romeo and Juliet type story with those two, Cook notes. But there's much more to it than that, Macmillan observes. He says Lyanna is a really important character that we hear about a lot in the novels and the series, but are yet to meet. Yeah, that's true. I'm not sure that, strictly speaking, for the Song of Ice and Fire, we need to actually meet her, but it's not essential, but I guess it's going to fill out the universe nicely. The playwright believes that Lyanna is the catalyst for so much that follows. In fact, I'd say that without Lyanna Stark, there is no Game of Thrones. Yeah, so if you removed Lyanna Stark from the narrative, the narrative would be hugely different. She does essentially spark the rebellion, even if that's not her intention. Macmillan joined the production at the end of 2018 and spent a while getting to grips with the wide range of material. Then he and Cook went to the US to meet with the celebrated author. The original idea had been to focus purely on the tournament of Harrenhal, but when he dug into the events of that tournament, there were so many stories that began there, says the writer. I became convinced we had to extend the proposed timeframe and follow them through. That's really interesting. So they're not just going to do the tournament, they're going to go beyond it a bit. I guess the obvious thing is Lyanna and Rhaegar meeting up after the tournament, and then Brandon going to King's Landing. Perhaps that's a thread. I think that should definitely be a thread that they follow, the quote-unquote abduction. Perhaps they will follow Jaime's thread as well, and what it's like to be a king's guard for a king who hates your father. But I would imagine, but that's really interesting. They're going to go beyond the tournament. That could give us some really interesting information, particularly about how Rhaegar and Lyanna get together, what exactly happened there. Together, he and Cook were looking at Shakespearean histories and tragedies and wanted to emulate their structures. Of course, he read and reread the Game of Thrones books and says they were the primary source. The play is based on events that are described in the books but took place several years earlier, which meant Macmillan had to sift through them looking for clues, establishing who was in attendance, what happened there, whose account was reliable. George has also written some fantastic histories, which were really useful. And then, of course, there were events which George has never previously revealed, things that have been the source of intense speculation, and I had to go directly to George for these. Okay, so kind of sounds similar to sort of what Ira Parker has been saying, looking at the source material a lot, chatting with George R.R. Martin. So that's quite hopeful, I think. And during the whole process, says Macmillan, the Game of Thrones creator was a fantastically trusting collaborator while also being protective of his characters and world. That sounds exactly like what the creators of the other shows have said about working with George R.R. Martin. The Royal Shakespeare Company seems to be a perfect fit. In fact, Martin long has spoken of his love for Shakespeare and how the RSC's acclaimed staging of the history plays were an inspiration to a young George R.R. Martin. So he's taken a lot of stuff from English history, from Scottish history, from Shakespeare. So in many ways, that's kind of a natural match, I think. Okay, so I think I'll stop it there. So will I go and see this in Stratford-upon-Avon? Probably not, but I imagine that once the script gets published, it's something that the fans will kind of pore over and analyse. So that looks like that might be an interesting addition to the world. Thanks for watching.